Welcome to the discussion. My guest today is Nikki Reed, a partner at KPMG. Nikki, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Let me set just a little bit of context for our discussion today. When Congress passed the CFO Act of 1990, their goal was to bring some consistency, some standardization to how agencies manage and report on their funding. 30 plus years later, the law not only empowered the CFO, but really transformed the entire federal financial management arena for agencies. Nearly every agency received a clean audit in 2020. I'm sure they'll do the same in 2021. Most have implemented strong internal controls, and the CFO role itself has been elevated to the senior strata. Well, now it's time for the CFO's office to transform once again. Congresswoman Carol Maloney introduced the CFO Vision Act of 2022 in March. That bill would standardize CFO responsibilities to enhance strategic decision-making, provide deputy CFOs with sufficient authority to minimize the effects of CFO turnover, revise financial management planning by requiring the release of government-wide and agency-level plans at least every 4 years to gauge progress in addressing financial management challenges, develop a broader set of financial management performance-based metrics to determine the status and progress agencies are making toward achieving cost-effective and efficient operations, and strengthen internal controls by requiring agencies to rigorously assess key financial information used in financial management and decision-making. Obviously, a lot going on in that bill. In fact, Senator Mark Warner is expected to introduce a similar bill in the upper chamber, too, and he already reduced the bill in earlier sessions of Congress. But those bills take a long time to get through the process. It could be years for all we know. So many ways what that legislation is doing is confirming and codifying what many agencies are already doing today. So then that's where my guest comes in, Nikki Reed, a partner at KPMG. Tell us how agencies are going to get ahead of this transformation, accelerate their transformation, and of course, improve their financial management efforts. So Nikki, let me start maybe at the beginning here. The role of the CFO obviously has changed. The finance function has changed over the last 30 years. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing and how that evolution is happening and has happened.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, wow, it's just so insane to think that the CFO Act happened over 30 years ago. You know, it seems like it was so much longer than that, right? Because so much has changed. And I remember, more than 20 years ago, starting my career in federal finance and just being completely overwhelmed by the amount of data that there was to manually go through and make decisions with. And oh, by the way, also, there's that much more data sources from which that data comes. And so just thinking about, starting as an associate all of those decades ago to where we are now, where data, there's still work to be done, but data is much more streamlined. It's a lot easier to make decisions now in the CFO function. You mentioned earlier that the CFO Act did a lot of things. It really changed the trajectory of finance in the federal organization. But I think there are two big things that it did well and did a lot for to change the trajectory. Specifically, as you mentioned, it's requiring all of the agencies to produce financial statements and then ultimately have them audited. And then to your point as well, it also really just somewhat credentialized even more the CFO as a strategist, as a resource in the executive levels of the organization to really drive change. And I think those things are continuing to elevate and evolve the CFO function for all agencies that we work with. One of my favorite clients says all the time, she said this coin and I've this phrase and I've now adopted it for myself. It's essentially that the CFO organization has and will continue to move from being an enabling function to being an empowering function. And to me, that is literally what all of this is all about, really going from nuts and bolts accounting to being a purely compliance-based organization, to being someone that's focused on operations, to really empowering mission areas and leadership in these agencies to make strategic decisions.
I think the piece there that's key is the enabler. And we've talked about technology as the enabler all the time. But now we're talking about, and I've seen this shift maybe over the last 10 years or so, data as the really biggest enabler. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned at the beginning of your discussion there, what's the difference between the data today than it was in 2000 when we started, you and I together, I guess, started looking at this about the same time? Is it better data? Is it more data? Is it the technology behind the data? What's different?
All of the above, all of the above. I mean, listen, again, we have a long way to go. I mean, we're still catching up with some of our counterparts in the commercial arena. But I'm very proud personally of the progress that the federal government has made with respect to data and technology. Again, in prior decades, the data was very dispersed. It was coming out of multiple different systems, and quite honestly, the quality wasn't there. You couldn't tell if what you were looking at was accurate, if it was even for the period that you were thinking that it was related to. And I think now, due to a lot of the CFO Act, there's just such rigor around the quality of the data and really, if you will, tracing the data to the business system and making sure that what's ultimately coming out from a data perspective really relates to the activity, the business event that occurred. And that's not an easy task. But I think with the tools and the access that the CFO function now has, it's making it a lot easier.
We've seen several pieces of legislation over the years to try to address that. Feels like 12 improper payment acts over the last year. Senator Carper, I think, has written most of those. We've seen the Data Act itself.
Absolutely.
How much has that also helped influence kind of where the government's been going with their financial data and understanding what it is, where it's at, standardize it? Is that, I know it's played a big role, but do you
Absolutely.
also kind of hang?
No, for sure. And listen, I'm a consultant, so we have tons of buzzwords, right? But I have to pull out two of them, which is transparency and accountability. And that is what these acts, IPERIA and IPERA before it, Data Act, as you mentioned, the GONE Act, the GREAT Act, all of these acts are really about making sure that your data is accurate, it's sound, and that it's telling the story of where you are today. And yes, you would like to think that organizations in themselves would just make these decisions to make sure that your data was accurate on their own, but sometimes you need a push, right? So having an act and some compliance to really drive that as a requirement has done wonders.
And it's more than just a push, I think, as well, because it's easy we're humans, right? We all kind of interpret things ourselves. So yes, federal financial management should be what is a general ledger and what goes into a general ledger. Well, you could say, well, these 7 things. I could say, well, these 8 things. And somebody's got to say, well, no, we're going to go with these 9 things or whatever it is. And I think that's what these laws and the effort by the financial management community has really changed. And that's part of that evolution. That's why the data is better.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to pick up on that, or I was going to go down the path of...
No, please.
All right. So one of the things that I think you also mentioned was data is becoming that enabler. What are you seeing from that enabler? How are CFOs and others in that budget and management side of the office, not OMB itself, but the agency one, driving those decisions through the data?
Yeah, I mean, we have really smart people in the CFO organizations.
I hope so.
Yes,
they manage the money.
absolutely, absolutely. They have to be, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you make decisions just based on experiences. Sometimes you make decisions just based on gut feel, right? But really, in this environment, you have to make decisions based on the data. And I think one of the most interesting things that I'm seeing a lot of our clients do today is, there's one thing to look back at historical data and say, okay, for the past 20 years we've done this, so let's assume that it's going to happen that way again. But with all of the change that's happening in our government, in our world, sometimes history isn't always the only predictor. And so having some of our agencies really embrace and leverage predictive analytics as an example is something that I am so excited about. When you think about the impacts to cash, when you think about the impacts to receivables, and you think about the impacts to how, from a budget perspective, the government needs to make decisions, being able to leverage sometimes non-quantitative or more so qualitative aspects of data in that decision making from a predictive standpoint is eye-opening and amazing. So that's probably the biggest thing that I'm seeing our clients start to do, and it's great.
There's a huge thread to pull from there. Let me start with maybe this one is, what does that mean when you say predictive analytics? Let's maybe define that a little bit, because a lot of people say, well, I use AI, and then they go, well, actually, you don't use predictive analytics. But so maybe let's define what you mean in the financial world.
Absolutely, absolutely. So predictive analytics, it does leverage historical data. So I don't want to paint the picture that history isn't involved. But predictive analytics is essentially the process whereby you use the information that is available to you to predict something that is going to happen in the future. There are different ways to do it. There are different tools out there. There are different methods and methodologies. Sometimes you lose statisticians or economists or hardcore data architects. But it is truly leveraging quantitative and qualitative information to inform decisions that will occur in the future.
And I think the history piece is really important too, because what agencies can see is, okay, during July, we usually spend this type of money, but it's trending differently this time based on what we've seen so far. So how do those two match up? Where are a lot of your clients at when it comes to using this? Is it beginning stages? I know everyone's different, so blanketing is hard, but what's the sense that you have?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, a lot of them are in the beginning stages. I mean, listen, we still are trying to make sure that the data is clean, right? And in order to leverage it for something like predictive analytics, you have to make sure that your input is accurate. So I think a lot of our agencies are really focused on that aspect of it. So I would qualify it as beginning stages, because we're still really making sure that we can make these sound decisions based on the information that we have. And quite honestly, that it's being captured in the way that we need it to be captured. You know, there's one thing to have general ledger data. There's one thing to have vendor data or customer data. There's another to have geographic data about your clients that bought something in 2012, right? And so some of this information that may not typically be financial really does help and impact predictive analytics. And so working with our clients to figure out, okay, what types of data sets do I really need to have to make sure that this analysis is accurate?
You mentioned this idea of clean data, but we have to be, I think it's important to be clear as well that you can't let the good be the enemy of perfect or perfect be the enemy of good either. Sometimes
Absolutely.
I've heard time and again, you have to get started on the data you have,
Absolutely.
and almost it will clean itself up. Are you seeing some of that happen too, where clients, whether public sector or private sector, maybe their data is not great today, but 6 weeks it's a little better, and 8 weeks it's a little better?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I can think of an example right now where, we're supporting a client. They're going through a major transformation. A lot of their work, they're trying to assess, should we move from a general fund to a working capital fund model? Well, in order to be in a working capital fund, you have to have a lot more insight and detail about how you're spending your money to develop whatever product or service you produce. And so in doing that, they have to have a lot more insights and information with respect to their data. And so they are doing exactly what you just described. They're realizing, listen, it's not perfect, but we have to start. And they're getting in. And the great thing about this organization in particular is that in doing so, they're using visualization. They're using data analytics. And oh my goodness, how easy is it to see where you have holes when you have a chart right here that you see every day that tells you, oh man, this shouldn't have been charged in that month. So I agree wholeheartedly with you. The key is to get started, but you also don't want to, you want to be, accountable for tax dollars and make sure that you're spending it in the right way, right? So have a plan, have a strategy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we further the discussion. Don't just, jump in, to make sure that you have a plan and a progress, and that the rest comes from there.
You also mentioned the idea of charts and dashboards and visualization tools, and we're going to get into that too as well. But what we're going to do, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue that conversation. My guest today is Nikki Reed, a partner at KPMG. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to the discussion, Modern Government, Expanding the Impact of Federal Finance, sponsored by KPMG on Federal News Network.